Cool. So we're going to get going again on the Serge. Last week we had our first session on this instrument, which is going to live in 1030C by the end of the month, so the end of September. Basically, last week was a bit of an overview, describing a bit of the functionality, going through some patch examples. We talked a little bit about the history of Serge, where it came from, what his ideas were back in the mid-70s when this all started. Not much preamble today. We're going to really kind of dive into it. If you remember last week, one of the main focuses at the very start was looking at these two panels here, which, as you remember, are modelled on the really early Serge systems, the 1973 to 75 systems. We're going to spend a little bit more time on these and look at some modules that we didn't have a look at. I've got a list of things that I'd like to get through, and of course I'll probably only get through half of them. But essentially we started with the slews, the positive slew and the negative slew. We looked at them as both envelope generators and as oscillators, but they can actually do a lot more than that. The concept that we talked about last week was patch programmability. Does anyone remember what that means?
More like building patches which do more complex things that normally like the Euro rack, which just have a module that already does that.
Exactly. Yeah. So what it means is that there's one module can do many things, and in order to create those functions, you patch it up. So you're kind of programming through patching. So the positives and negative slews are probably the best example of modules that allow that type of programming and patching in the system. So we looked at them as oscillators and envelopes. I'm going to show you a couple of other uses for it. And then one of the focuses today is about finding some kind of interesting control voltages. We looked at envelopes as a way of generating control voltages. We looked at sequencers. We had this 8-step sequencer, which I realized I called a 10-step sequencer, with 2 outputs. And we also looked at the TKB. We're going to use these today, but kind of focus less on them. I want to talk a little bit about sample and hold, because there's a few different ways that we can generate random voltages or generate interesting kind of staircase voltages using this process called sample and hold. It's not completely obvious how to do sample and hold in this system, but there are, like a lot of the Serge system and workflow, there are many different ways of doing the same process. And so I'm going to show you a few of them. I'm also hoping to look at a few things to do with waveshaping. So Serge as well as Buchla at this particular time, one of their focuses, instead of the kind of subtractive approach of Moog and others at this time, a lot of the sound generation techniques were about creating complex sounds from smaller, less complex sounds. So rather than having a very rich waveform and using a filter to kind of chew things out, a lot of the focus in West Coast synthesis was building up complexity from the ground up. And so things like wave shapers, distortion modules, as well as frequency modulation, amplitude modulation, ring modulation, etc., are a real feature. So I'm going to have a look at a couple of those and show you a couple of interesting, probably less, I guess, standard ways of using the system. So I want to start with the positive slew because we know about what a positive slew is. A positive slew, as we remember from last week, probably the best way to think of a positive slew is that it's the just the kind of attack portion of a envelope generator. That's one way to think of what a positive slew is. However, it can be many other things. As we saw, we can make it into an oscillator. What I want to do now, though, is actually use the positive slew as what it says in the name, as a slew. All right. So in order to create an oscillator or an envelope, what we were doing is we were taking the end of rise gate or pulse, and we're putting it in the input. You can also put it in this start input, and we're going to do that today, just to kind of self-cycle it. And I'm not going to pan down to the mixer, because you should also all know that there's a mixer down the bottom right here. I'm just going to put this in the output so we can actually hear it as an oscillator. Okay, and we've got a pot up here that can change the pitch, right? Okay, so that's fine. That's one use of a slew. But you notice here that we actually have an input. Remember I mentioned last week that anything with a triangle like this is an input. how we were using the input last week is I was actually cycling it using the input. It's a slightly different tone, and it also is a slightly different pitch, just owing to the internal architecture of the circuit. But it basically does the same thing. But here what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the slew as what we call a lag processor, which is kind of what it's designed to do. And what that means is if we take some kind of a control voltage, and I'm going to use a sequencer. So I'm going to use this 8-step sequencer here. And we're going to use the positive slew and also the negative slew just to show how we can use them to create portamento or glide using the slews. So to get this sequencer going, I'm going to grab a pulse. This over here, hang on, let's use this one down here. This over here, you can see this kind of flashing light. We're going to talk about this module a little bit later. This is a dual slopes. So it's essentially an envelope with a gate output and an envelope output. I'm going to use this as a clock for my sequencer, okay? Just so that we can go up and down. And if I put it in the clock input, our sequencer should go. Okay? If you remember last week, if I just wanted 3 steps, I press the 3rd button and it goes back and forth. If I want all 8 steps, I go up the top. Okay? Awesome. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use a standard oscillator. Zoom out. This one over here is called the new timbral oscillator. It's fantastic. I think it dates back to the early 80s. I could be wrong. And we're going to take its output and we're going to put it directly in. Oh, there it is. So we're just going out the sine output. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this sequencer. I'm going to do, let's just do 4 steps. I'm going to add a couple of pitches. I'm going to take the A output of the sequencer and put it into the volt per octave input of our oscillator. Okay. Pretty simple sequence here. I can change some of the pitches. And you hear what's going on with the new timbral oscillator in the volt per octave input. As it receives a new voltage, it immediately snaps to that new pitch. Okay? Which is what you expect of an oscillator of this type. So I'm going to zoom out and I want to show you, why is this? How to integrate the positive and negative slews into this. All right. New timbral oscillator is probably not the best example because it's already got a portamento control in there. But I want to show you how you can patch this up because you might not be using a new timbral oscillator. So we've got our A output going into the volt per octave. I'm going to break that. And we're going to put this into the positive slew, the input of the positive slew up here. And remembering that all of your frequency or time pots, I got it wrong last week. When we go to the right, it's at its fastest setting, and we go to the left, it's at its slowest setting. So the idea here is that we're breaking that connection and we're processing the voltage through the positive slew. It's not cycling on itself, it's just acting on the voltage that's coming out. So I take its output and I put it back into the volt per octave of our new timbral oscillator. So sequencer into positive slew, out to our oscillator. Okay, now this is at its fastest setting, so we're not hearing any change. It's just snapping straight to, but as soon as I slow this down, have a listen to what happens. I'm going to slow that down so you can hear it. Okay. So this is a positive slew, which means what? So it's basically the attack portion of an envelope, right? So as the voltage rises, what this module does is it slews or lags that voltage, only when it's going up. Okay, so you can hear when the pitches go down, it immediately goes down. When it goes up, we have slew, okay? could do the opposite. And I can take the sequencer and put it into a negative slew. And take the negative slew output. And now if I slow down the negative slew, okay, does the opposite. Alright, so that's a really useful way of processing voltages in the system. There's plenty of other ways of processing voltages, that's just one way. Do you remember what we did last week to create an AD envelope using the positive and negative slew? Remember what we did? Exactly, yeah. So we cross-patched these two. So we can basically create portamento with differing speeds on the attack and the decay by doing the same thing. So if we actually put the voltage into the positive first, and it's going to slew the positive, and the negatives won't be slewed at all. We take the whole output and we put it in the negative, and remember, it's not going to affect the positive, it'll only affect the negative. Alright. So now, we're coming out of the negative slew, because we've got this chain which says sequencer, positive slew, negative slew, oscillator. So let's do the negative slew first. Positive slew. Okay. So there's not the same cross-patching as we did last week where it's oscillating on itself, it's not triggering itself, but we've got two sets of processing. We're processing the input by the positive, and it's passing the negative unchanged, which means that this one can then change the negative. Okay, so that's a pretty kind of standard way of using a positive negative slew. We'll come down to the dual universal slope oscillator, generator in a minute. The dual universal slope generator basically takes this concept and puts two of these into the same module. All right, so you've got an attack and a release, or a positive slew and a negative slew, and you've got two of them. So it's really flexible. You've also got a 1 volt per octave input, so you can actually use it as an oscillator if you wanted to. Okay. Remember as well that every single one of these has a voltage control input. Okay, so what we're doing here, everything's kind of gone off kilter here, but let me just zoom in so you can see. There we go. So I've been changing the speed manually here, but you could have a control voltage that changes the length of that slew. All right, voltage control input. Anytime you see VC, that's giving us control over that. Okay, cool. So that's these are lag processes or slews. All right. Now I'm going to show you another use for this. We're not going to slew this voltage at all. We're going to take the sequencer and we're going to put it directly in the new temporal oscillator. You're going to get sick of this sequence after a while. Okay. Cool. And now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the positive slew for something that you probably don't expect it to be used for, and that's as an amplifier, as a VCA. Okay, so a VCA is usually something that you would put an envelope into and it opens up the volume. All right. Essentially what a VCA is doing is it's kind of acting, and a low pass filter as well, it's acting as a slew. It essentially is a really fast slew. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, instead of taking the sine output and putting it directly to my mixer, I'm going to take the sine output and I'm going to put it into a positive slew, this one here, make it super fast, and then I'm going to take its output and put it in the mixer. Okay, so first of all, what do you hear? More harmonics, right? Okay. So what's happening is there's a little bit of wave shaping going on as we put the audio signal, remember this is running at audio rate, through the positive slew. It's trying to catch up every time it hears a positive voltage. And remember, this is bipolar. It's going really, really fast. It's trying to catch up, and as it tries to catch up, it's adding harmonics. All right. So listen to what happens when I slow down the rate of the slew. It becomes both a volume pot and a timbre pot. All right. So we've used this as an envelope. We've used it as an oscillator. We use it as a slew, and now we're using it as a VCA. This is like classic Serge patch programmability. So because we've got a VC input, let's take the same signal, which is clocking our oscillator, clocking our sequence rather, put it into an envelope generator. Up here, I'm putting it in the start. And I'm going to use this to control the volume, amplitude. And what I'm going to do is back off the offset. So it's a particular flavor of VCA. All right. So just from these modules, we can create sound, we can process CV, and we can process audio. It's pretty amazing. There are better sounding VCAs in the system, but if you run out of a VCA, you know you've got two here that you can use. Okay. All right. Pretty over that sequence by now. All right, cool. So that's awesome. We're already starting to get into some wave shaping. So how about we explore some wave shaping with a couple of the modules that we have that are dedicated for that. Up the top, I mentioned these last week. Why is this off kilter like that? All right, up the top, I'm going to zoom in on the triple wave shaper, which I have actually a version of the triple wave shaper in my Eurorack system, because I absolutely love this module. It's really flexible. You can do a lot of things with it. The triple wave shaper is basically three kind of distortion wave shaping circuits in one. In the original Serge manual from 1976, it says that its function is to translate a saw wave into a sine wave. That's what it says that it does. All right, it does a little bit more than that. I'm going to take I'm not going to voltage control that. I'm going to take the saw wave from down here. You have to I'm not going to zoom out. This is a saw wave from the new timbre oscillator. I'm going to put it in one of the inputs of the triple wave shaper. I'm going to open it right up. No, put it right down. And remember, the brown outputs are bipolar voltages. All right, so what we're talking about is AC or audio. I'm going to take it and put it into our mixer. Okay, so we got no sound because I've got this pot right down. As I open it up, remember it's a saw wave. The saw wave should just sound like this by itself. Okay, but if I take it and put it in the triple wave shaper, let's have a listen to what it sounds like. Okay, so it does what it says on the tin. It sounds like a sine wave. It's not, again, last week we saw that a sine wave in analog land is a pure sine. But if I compare it with the actual sine itself, I'm taking another cable, taking the sine, put it in another input of the mixer. It's close enough. Okay. But of course this is voltage controllable, right? So if we were to take that sequence and use that to control, so I'm going to take the sequence that I was using for pitch before, and I'll control the triple wave shaper. Subtle effect. The second one actually has a slightly different effect on the sound. A bit more subtle. Let's crank some of that. Okay, so what I've done is I've added a higher voltage from my sequencer. That's cool. What if we actually took the sequencer and put it through a positive slew first? We should get a rising voltage then to control the triple wave shaper. As it goes up, we hear it moving rather than stepping, yeah? Cool. Why are there three of them? Well, because the whole idea with this module, and a lot of modules like it when you've got multiples of things, is that you can stack things on top of each other. So what I've got here is this is the output. Instead of taking the output from the first wave shaper, I'm going to take it from the last one. I'm going to use these short cables, and we're going to take the output of the first one, put it in the input of the second one. Take the output of the second one, put it into the input of the third one. Okay, let's take some other voltage. Take it from the TKB. Put it in the second one, and we'll clock the TKB with something fast, like this one. So those kinds of sounds, rather than taking a super rich waveform like a square wave or a saw wave or something like that, and then putting it into a filter to get timbral modulation, what we've got here is we're using a wave shaper to bring out harmonics. So it's the opposite of the kind of subtractive approach. The opposite, if we were to say that in normal language, would be additive, but we don't call this additive. Additive synthesis is another type of synthesis, but this is, yeah, wave shaping, kind of distortion-based synthesis. All right, I'm going to take that one step further, and we're going to forget the oscillator for now. I'm going to also take out the modulation, and I want to show you one of my favorite uses for this particular module, and we'll get to another wave shaper in a minute, and that is for feedback patching. Feedback patching is really easy to do on the Serge for a couple of reasons. One, it's got some processing modules in there that are really good for feeding back on each other, and they create some interesting sounds. And we've also got these processors over here which allow us to kind of stack up processes and add them and subtract them from each other. All right. So what do we got here if we've got no inputs? I'm going to zoom in to have a look at the just the wave shaper. Really stiff this camera. There we go. My panning was much more artful last week. Okay, cool. So what I've got is I've got a triple wave shaper. Its output, the first one's going into the second input, the second one's going into the third input. We've got no output coming out the end. All right. So what we want to do to create feedback is we can take any one of these points and feed it back into itself. All right. We don't actually have an input at the moment. Right. So what I'm going to do, rather than going straight into the input, is I'm actually going to take the last output here, which is the end of the chain. Right. Let's scoot over a little bit. Oop. Okay. And let's take a look at these dual processors. If we remember last week, these dual processors, they take 3 inputs, and you've got an attenuator on each. This one scales the input in the positive and scales it in the negative. You've got 3 of them, and the combination, the addition of those spit out the end. You've also got an offset which scales everything up. It's like kind of adding towards the end. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this at noon, which means that there's no amplification of the signal whatsoever. I take the output of the triple wave shaper at the end of the chain and put it in that input. And now I'm going to take the output of the dual processor and put it back in. Okay. All right. Now we've got nothing going to the mixer. So I'm going to take the final output. You can take anywhere, but I'm going to take the final output and put it in our mixer channel and have a listen to what happens. All right, so I've opened up the channel. Nothing yet. Listen to what happens when I open this one up. Nothing. Chaos. So dumb. Now, the position of all of these knobs is going to completely change the sound that comes out, as well as this rhythmic aspect. The thing that I really love about this one is that it does get locked into these weird rhythmic cycles, which is very unpredictable. So if I slightly change this knob by a millimeter, I love that sound. It's ridiculous. It's noise music, right? One thing that I love doing is taking that sound and then starting to process it. So we've got these beautiful filters where we can really kind of tame that sound and use it as an interesting gesture, for instance. Okay, so what I could do is, this is not going to be the most artful video, apologies. How do I get that to be straight? Why is that?
The legs.
The legs are a bit off, aren't they? Let's say, all right, that'll do. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple of things here. I'm going to take this particular sound, I'm going to process it so that we can get some interesting tones out of it. So this is the sound. This is the sound as is. I'm going to take its output, I'm going to put it in a filter. So this is our VCFQ from last week. And I'm going to let's take the bandpass output and put it in here. Remember how it rang out last week when we were doing the triggering? Okay, what we could do now, just having listened to that sound, is I could take one of these outputs here. I could see what it does if I used it to clock the sequencer. I'm not sure if it's going to clock the sequencer. The sequencer requires some kind of a gate to clock it. Let's see what happens. Yep. See that? It's moving. All right, so what does that mean? We can use the process.
What's moving?
This sequencer down here, if I zoom in. I've used an output from the triple wave shaper to clock the sequencer. Down here. And every time it gets a rising edge, it's moving this sequencer. Okay?
It's moving through it sequentially?
Yeah.
Just really fast at some point?
That's right. There's some points that it's going quite fast, okay, right? Because it's receiving it at audio rate, right? So we've got a clock here. Let's take the A output and we'll
isn't it consistent which ones go quick?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
That's the honest answer. I'm not sure. And it's gone. Goodbye.
See ya.
Oh gosh.
Sounds like someone's stepping on a mouse.
I know.
This doesn't sound
No, it doesn't sound right. Not right now. Okay. Let's take the B row. So it's semi-consistent, that sound. I'm gonna take the B row, and what we're gonna do is I'm actually going to modulate. Take the B row and I'm going to modulate the process itself using the signal. So now then we'll have feedback both in terms of audio and also the process. Let's go. All right.
Sorry, what did you do?
So now another row of the sequencer is modulating the Waveshaper itself. Okay, so it's clocking the Waveshaper. The Waveshaper is changing it as well as the It's kind of ridiculous. I can change the range of it. Okay. Oh, that's so dumb. I love it. Okay. Okay. Let's take something else. I'm going to take one of these envelope generators. Does anyone remember what I've done here? I'm taking the end of the envelope and put it into the start, which means I'm cycling it. So Erez asked last week, what do we use the A minus B for in the sequencer? Well, here I've got a relationship between these two rows of sequences. A is changing the filter, B is changing the Waveshaper, but I can do A minus B, and I can use that to change the speed, for instance, of the panning now. See what that gives.
Sorry, how did you use the panning again?
So the panning down here, on the stereo mixer, what we have is we have our input for the audio, and we have a pan pot down here. The pan pot has a direction on it, so there's a little arrow there. And what that means is that when you're sending it positive voltage on this input will send it from left to right. So what I've got above is I've got a positive voltage coming from a cycling envelope generator, and that's changing the panning. And I'm using the sequencer to change the rate of that panning as well. Oh, it's gone. There it is. Come back.
It's really quiet.
Okay, so yeah, it does. So remember this this dual processor at the top. There's so much more I want to show you. This dual processor at the top is just facilitating the feedback. When it's at noon, we got no feedback. When it's positive, we get feedback. So that could be a performative control in and of itself. Okay. Oh, it's gone.
Why does it keep...
Because it gets locked in cycles, and then sometimes it doesn't have a voltage high enough for it to regenerate itself. So there's all this stuff going underneath which we don't really understand. I don't. And now what I could do is I could use this dual processor, which is actually supposed to be for control voltage, and I could put an audio signal into it. So I'm going to take some white noise. And so remember, the output of this is going back into the wave shaper, right? So let's take some white noise. That sounds so dumb.
Asthmatic chicken.
Typical chicken noise.
Come on. Little nudge. Go and give it a nudge.
Chicken bones.
Cool. So they were. It's just pinned it out naturally. It's like I'm done. Cool. So that's a type of feedback which you could play around with the triple wave shaper. We have another wave shaper down here which I'm going to use in a much more kind of standard way so that you can hear what it does to the sound.